She saw him walk in. Just another tired man in worn-out clothes, probably looking for a cheap coffee and a place to sit. Sarah Monroe had dealt with customers like him before. The kind who linger for hours, tip poorly, and act as if they belong. With an irritated sigh, she barely concealed her annoyance as she took his order, certain he wouldn't be worth her time. But within minutes, her entire world was about to flip upside down. Because this man wasn't just another customer, he was the CEO of the company that owned the cafe. And by the time she realized her mistake, it was too late. The cafe on Main Street bustled with its usual afternoon rush. Waitress Sarah Monroe barely glanced up as another customer walked in. His clothes were worn, his shoes scuffed, and he carried an air of quiet exhaustion. Just another broke customer, she thought, probably here to sit for hours and buy nothing but a cheap coffee. Sarah sighed, rolling her eyes as he settled into a corner booth. With a forced smile, she approached. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone laced with subtle disinterest. The man studied the menu for a moment. "I'll have the house special and a black coffee." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You sure? It's not exactly cheap." The man simply nodded. His calm demeanor annoyed her. She had seen too many like him. People who counted every penny and left no tip. Without another word, she scribbled down his order and walked off, muttering under her breath. Minutes later, she returned with his food and set the plate down a little too hard. "Enjoy." The man took a slow sip of his coffee and studied her. "Do you always treat customers this way?" Sarah scoffed. "Only the ones wasting my time." The man smirked, as if he knew something she didn't. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black card, and placed it on the table. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the company logo. This wasn't just any card. It belonged to the CEO of the very corporation that owned the cafe. He leaned back, eyes sharp. "I'm not just a customer. I own this place." Silence fell between them as Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth, but words failed her. The cafe's hum seemed distant now, her pulse thundering in her ears. A nervous chuckle escaped her lips. "You're joking, right?" The man, no, the CEO, shook his head slowly. "No joke. And now, I have to ask myself, do I want someone with your attitude representing my business?" Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. She had been working at this cafe for nearly 3 years, and while she had her bad days, she never imagined it would cost her job. The CEO took another sip of his coffee, eyes never leaving her. I didn't mean any disrespect," she stammered, suddenly desperate to undo the damage. He tilted his head. "Didn't you? You assumed I had no money. You treated me like I didn't matter." A heavy silence stretched between them. Other customers were beginning to notice the tension. The manager, Lisa, stepped out from the back, her brow furrowing as she took in the scene. "What's going on here?" Lisa asked, her gaze darting between Sarah and the CEO. Sarah swallowed hard, but before she could speak, the CEO leaned forward. "I was just explaining to your employee how customer service should be handled." Lisa paled as she realized who she was speaking to. "Mr. Reynolds. I didn't realize you were here today." He nodded. "Clearly, neither did your staff." Sarah's knees felt weak. She thought about all the times she had dismissed customers like him. How many opportunities had she lost because of her assumptions? Mr. Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temple. "I don't believe in making rash decisions, but I do believe in accountability." He met Sarah's gaze. "You tell me, why should I keep you here?" Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had one chance to redeem herself, and she had to take it. "I was wrong," she admitted, voice trembling. "I judged you before I knew anything about you, and that's not fair, to you or anyone else. If you give me a chance, I'll prove that I can do better." Mr. Reynolds studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "I'll be watching." Sarah exhaled shakily as he stood up, leaving enough cash on the table to cover the meal, plus a generous tip. As he walked out the door, she knew one thing for sure. She would never make that mistake again. Sarah's stomach churned as she wiped down the empty table where Mr. Reynolds had sat just moments ago. Her hands trembled, the realization of what had just happened sinking in like a lead weight in her chest. The cafe, which had been filled with casual chatter just minutes ago, now hummed with hushed whispers. Every pair of eyes seemed to flick toward her, their curiosity laced with silent judgment. Lisa, the cafe manager, stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was a mix of disbelief and frustration. "Sarah," Lisa said finally, her voice low but firm, "do you have any idea what you just did?" Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. She hesitated, shaking her head. "I didn't know who he was." Lisa let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of her nose. "That's exactly the problem." Sarah clenched her fists, guilt twisting inside her. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had simply made a mistake, but the truth was undeniable. She had judged a man without knowing anything about him, treated him like he was beneath her, and now she was paying the price. "I can fix this," Sarah said, but even she wasn't sure if that was true. Lisa exhaled sharply. "You better hope you get the chance." The rest of her shift was unbearable. Every time a customer walked in, Sarah couldn't shake the paranoia that they, too, might be someone important, someone watching her. Was today her last day? Would she walk in tomorrow only to find a termination letter waiting for her? By the time her shift ended, her nerves were frayed. As she walked home through the dimly lit streets, her thoughts spiraled. She had been working at the cafe for 3 years. It wasn't the dream job she had envisioned for herself, but it had paid the bills. She had started out bright-eyed and ambitious, but over time, the monotony of the job, the entitled customers, and the constant exhaustion had worn her down. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing people as people and started seeing them as inconveniences. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from Lisa. "Staff meeting, 8 a.m. sharp. Be ready." Sarah's heart pounded. This was it. She barely slept that night, tossing and turning as anxiety clawed at her mind. What would Mr. Reynolds say? Would he fire her in front of everyone? Would she get a chance to explain herself? Morning came too soon. Dressed in her neatly pressed uniform, Sarah arrived at the cafe before the doors opened. Her co-workers were already inside, huddled together in tense silence. No one spoke, but their glances told her they all knew why they were here. Then the front door swung open. Mr. Reynolds stepped inside. The air seemed to tighten around them. He was dressed differently today, no longer in the worn-out clothes she had so carelessly judged. His crisp suit and polished shoes screamed authority, making it impossible to ignore the weight of his presence. He scanned the room, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze landed on Sarah. "Good morning," he said, his tone calm but firm. No one responded. He took a step forward, placing a hand casually in his pocket. "Let's get straight to the point." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Customer service isn't just about serving food and drinks," Mr. Reynolds continued. "It's about respect. It's about treating every single person with dignity, whether they look like they own the place or like they barely have a dollar to their name." His eyes locked onto Sarah's, and she felt herself shrink under his gaze. "What happened yesterday wasn't just bad service," he said. "It was a failure in judgment." A wave of shame crashed over her. She had never felt so exposed. "But," Mr. Reynolds continued, "I don't believe in throwing people away over one mistake." A murmur ran through the staff. Sarah barely breathed. "I'm giving you a choice," he said, his voice steady. "You can leave now, and we'll consider this your resignation. Or, you can stay and prove that you're better than that moment." Sarah's hands clenched at her sides. She could feel the weight of every mistake she had ever made pressing down on her. This was her second chance. But was she truly ready? She met his gaze, her voice quiet but firm. "I want to prove it." Mr. Reynolds studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then I expect to see real change. You start today." Sarah swallowed hard. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Determined. Sarah stepped behind the counter, her hands clammy as she adjusted her apron. Every movement felt heavier. Every glance from her co-workers weighed down with unspoken judgment. They had seen her at her worst, treating a customer, no, their boss, with disrespect. Lisa stood beside her, arms crossed. "You've got a lot to prove," she muttered. "I know," Sarah whispered. The cafe doors swung open, and the first wave of morning customers strolled in. Sarah inhaled deeply, steadying herself as she forced a welcoming smile. "Good morning. What can I get started for you?" The older woman in front of her, bundled in a knitted scarf, placed her order. Sarah prepared the coffee with extra care, sliding it across the counter with both hands. "Thank you," the woman said kindly. Sarah nodded, the weight in her chest loosening, until she caught sight of Mr. Reynolds sitting at a corner table. Her stomach flipped. He was watching, not in an overtly intimidating way, but enough that she felt her every move was being evaluated. She knew this wasn't just about making coffee. It was about proving that she could be better. Hours passed. Every customer interaction felt like a test. Then the door jingled again. A man entered, tall, unshaven, his clothes stained from work, his boots caked in dried mud. He looked tired, worn, like he'd been carrying a heavy burden for too long. Sarah stiffened. This was her moment of truth. If this had been yesterday, she might have dismissed him, assumed he wouldn't tip, judged him before he even opened his mouth. But today she saw him differently. She stepped forward. "Welcome. What can I get for you?" The man hesitated. His fingers fumbled in his pocket before he pulled out a handful of crumpled bills. Just a black coffee," he muttered. "Small." Sarah glanced at his hands. They were rough, calloused, hands of a man who worked hard. She didn't hesitate. "How about a large?" "On the house." His head snapped up, eyes flickering with surprise. "You serious?" Sarah smiled genuinely. "Absolutely." The man exhaled, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had just lessened, if only by a fraction. "Thank you," he murmured. As Sarah handed him the cup, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe kindness didn't cost anything. Maybe respect wasn't about who could afford what. As the man took his first sip and gave her a nod of gratitude, Sarah felt it, the moment she had been waiting for. She turned slightly and found Mr. Reynolds watching her. This time he nodded. She had passed the first test. The cafe bustled with activity, but for Sarah, time seemed to slow. Every cup of coffee she poured, every smile she offered, it all felt like an unspoken test. Mr. Reynolds was watching. She could feel his gaze from the corner of the room, not in a harsh or punishing way, but like a teacher evaluating a student who had once failed an exam. She had made progress, but was it enough? Lisa approached from behind, speaking low enough that only Sarah could hear. "You think a couple of free coffees and nice words will erase what happened?" Sarah's grip on the counter tightened. No, she wasn't that naive. "I'm not trying to erase it," she said, voice steady. "I'm trying to fix it." Lisa studied her for a long moment before giving a slight nod and walking away. Then the door swung open again. A woman stormed inside, frustration evident in every step. She was well-dressed, holding an expensive leather bag in one hand and a receipt in the other. "Trouble." "Excuse me," the woman snapped, marching straight up to the counter. "I ordered an oat milk latte earlier and this," she held up the cup as if it were contaminated, "is almond milk." "I'm allergic." Sarah's chest tightened. The woman's voice carried through the cafe, and she could already feel the tension in the air. A week ago, Sarah might have rolled her eyes, muttered something under her breath, or given a half-hearted apology. But not today. This was another test. She exhaled slowly, keeping her voice calm. "I'm really sorry for the mistake. Let me fix it for you right away." The woman glared. "That's not the point. You could have sent me to the hospital." Sarah didn't flinch. "I understand, and I take that seriously. Your safety matters, and I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." The woman still looked irritated, but her posture eased slightly. She had expected a fight. Instead, she got understanding. Sarah swiftly remade the drink, placing it on the counter with both hands. Here you go. And again, I truly apologize. The woman eyed her, as if searching for sarcasm or insincerity. But when she found none, she simply sighed. Fine, she muttered, grabbing the cup and heading for the door. As soon as she left, Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then, a voice behind her. Not bad. She turned sharply, Mr. Reynolds. His expression was unreadable, but there was something different in his eyes. You handled that better than I expected, he said. Tell me, why didn't you get defensive? Sarah hesitated. Because I was wrong, and fighting wouldn't have changed that. For the first time since their encounter, Mr. Reynolds smiled. Just slightly. Good answer. Then, before she could say anything else, he checked his watch and straightened his jacket. You're improving, Sarah. But improvement isn't enough. She swallowed hard. What do you mean? He met her gaze, his voice even. I need to know if I can trust you. With that, he turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Sarah standing there, heart pounding. Trust. She hadn't earned it yet, but she would. The weight of Mr. Reynolds' words lingered in Sarah's mind long after he left the cafe. I need to know if I can trust you. Trust. She had spent so much of her life assuming that people only judged her on what they saw at first glance. Just as she had done to Mr. Reynolds. Now she understood. Trust wasn't given. It was earned. And she was about to face her final test. The next morning, the cafe was busier than usual. A rush of customers kept Sarah on her toes, but she moved with a confidence she hadn't felt before. Then, just before noon, he walked in. Mr. Reynolds. But this time he wasn't alone. A tall man in a dark suit entered behind him, carrying an expensive leather briefcase. The air in the cafe seemed to shift as the two of them made their way to the counter. Lisa, standing beside Sarah, whispered, That's the regional director of the entire company. Sarah's heart pounded. This was it. Mr. Reynolds stepped forward, placing his hands on the counter. Sarah, he said evenly, before I order, I need to ask you something. She swallowed, standing tall. Of course, sir. He studied her carefully, then gestured toward the customers waiting in line, the tables filled with people. Tell me, if I weren't standing here, if you didn't know who I was, would you still be doing your job the same way? Silence filled the cafe. Sarah didn't hesitate. Yes, she said firmly, because it's not just about you. It's about them. She gestured to the customers. They deserve respect, whether they have $1 million in their account or just enough for a coffee. I didn't understand that before, but I do now. Mr. Reynolds held her gaze for a long moment. Then, to her shock, he smiled. You've learned the most important lesson of all, he said. He turned to the regional director. I told you she was worth keeping. Lisa gasped. A few baristas exchanged looks. Sarah blinked. Wait, what? Mr. Reynolds crossed his arms. I could have fired you that day, but I saw potential. I saw someone who just needed to be humbled, not destroyed. So I gave you a chance. The regional director nodded approvingly. And it seems like that chance paid off. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She had been tested not just on her ability to serve coffee, but on her ability to change. And she had passed. Mr. Reynolds placed his usual order. This time, Sarah made it with steady hands, handing it over with a genuine smile. As he took the cup, he leaned in slightly. Keep this up, Sarah. You might have a future beyond that counter. With that, he walked away, leaving her standing there, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next.